Arjun Paliwal, it's time for another listener's choice, mate. You ready?
Mate, it's good to be back, and I'm loving these listeners' choices. They're always good fun.
Me too. And I like it just to get a little bit more variety in what we're doing as well. So instead of, actually this was your idea originally, because it's like, instead of just talking about all of these areas that I think are good, let's really dig deep into every area that people are thinking, because even if it's a no or it's a go, either way, it's super valuable to understand it in more detail. So this one's been sent in by Alan. And just in case if you're wanting to send one in as well, click the link in the show notes below. There's a little tab where you basically just have to put in, it's pretty much just what area you actually want. And if you can give us more information as well, then we can give you a more detailed response. I don't know why I'm saying we, Arjun can. I'm not taking credit for this. I think I always do that. So Alan has sent in Central Coast, especially Terrigal, units versus houses. So Arj, do you want to jump in with just the fast five to begin with?
Yeah, so from the housing and unit perspective of Terrigal, we've got a pretty broad price shift, right? We've got Terrigal houses at sort of $1.4 million average prices.
Yep.
And then you've got units, which depending on the data source is sort of that 700, 800,000, but they can go up and down a fair bit depending on where you are in Terrigal. Now, in terms of this particular market, there is a large shift in vacancy rates that gets pretty common in this particular market, because I think the holiday letting has a big part to do that. Terrigal, for those who don't know, is a beachside suburb. It's part of the Central Coast. And we see vacancy rates on a postcode level switch from 0.7, 0.8, all the way up to 4.5%, quite drastically and commonly. And so
that's huge.
Big jump. And I do feel that from a holiday letting, that's one core part of it. Because Airbnb is very popular. In fact, I've got a dear friend who's probably listening to this episode, and he's a good client of ours as well. And him and his partner actually have multiple Terrigal, I think they're townhouses / units. They're units, and they've got them on Airbnb, and they're doing really well for them in terms of a cash flow perspective. So you can see that that would feed in popularity-wise to many families who are thinking of it, and that might shift vacancy rates.
When you're saying they shift, how quick? Was that just like over a few months? Was that over a few years? What are we talking?
I'm talking a few months. So you get seasonality, right? Where you have some months in the hotter parts of the year that go below 1% vacancy. And then you've got the other times of the year where they lift up to 2, 3, and 4.5% vacancy rates.
4.5, that's huge. Okay, so below 1% to over 4.5% or around 4.5%. What about days on market as far as the demand side of things is concerned?
Yeah, so right now, days on market has elevated a fair bit because of the cycle that changed in this market over the last 12 months. But in terms of over long-term averages, it's a very fast-selling market. Not right now, but in terms of in general, it's a very fast-selling area.
Okay, and what is it looking like normally versus now?
Yeah, so in terms of the various data sources, we've got days on market in the sort of 40s and 50s now. But I do feel like that includes a lot of the campaign, and they do sell much quicker. Like I'm talking in a few weeks. And it's something very common with days on market statistics where
they're a bit skewed.
Yeah, they're quite skewed. But then in the past, we've seen days on markets as low as sort of 30s for the suburb. And so even then, I would say that's skewed and it wouldn't be faster, because me knowing Central Coast very well personally, my dad has a business there. I have a property there as well. Things do sell very quickly in this region of Central Coast when they're really on.
Right. Okay. And as far as 12 months data is concerned on the capital growth side of things, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so with Central Coast, much like many parts of this interest rate cycle impacted areas down the coastlines of New South Wales, we did see values dip over the last 12 months. And depending on data sources, you could say kind of between 6 and 12%, depending on Terrigal, or maybe if you extract Terrigal from a suburb level to a more like area level, or SA3 level is what we like to call it. So I would say between sort of 6 and 12% you've seen value dips over the last 12 months, which has taken away a lot of the growth that happened in the later parts of 2021. On a 5-year average though, it's still risen a fair bit, because that 2020 and 2021 boom in Terrigal was pretty aggressive. It's just now that it's taken 2022 has pretty much stripped away the second half of 2021's actual capital growth. So it's kind of dipped back and almost lost a year in time.
And what about economy-wise? I'm assuming this is very much a tourist town. There's not like big industry moving in or anything like that.
No, it's not so much a tourist town. Many people in the Central Coast are starting to make it feel like it's a part of Sydney. And this is a big vibe that's shifting. And I noticed that this will probably be something that'll happen a lot more even in the likes of Melbourne and Brisbane when they connect more cities together over time. Now, Geelong is already one good example of a pretty connected city. But more and more as time goes on, people don't think of them as separate cities. They think of it as a part of Greater Melbourne. And so that's the case here with Terrigal, where Central Coast as a region is feeling like it's a part of Greater Sydney.
isn't it like, because we did Rosebud not that long ago, and I remember asking a similar question because I think Rosebud was like 65 Ks away, something like that. And you were saying how you went out there for the hot springs, and it's like it's still commutable. But Terrigal, aren't we looking at like 200 Ks or like there's a real decent amount of travel?
No, it's not that far in terms of timelines. Yes, it's decent kilometer wise, but there are highways, there are pretty big roads. Like for context, my dad for the last decade has been driving there and back from Terrigal in terms of, going for work. And he goes even further than Terrigal. He goes up to Long Jetty, which is a bit further in Central Coast. So what that means is that people do commute from a work and home quite regularly. In his case, on the good days, it was like 55 minutes. On a bad day, it was an hour 25. And so I can see this sort of shift depending on who you are impacting you. But the main thing is when you've got this sort of price point, circa 1.5 million to 3 million, depending on the types of dwellings and how grand the home is, these are actually quite affordable to be living on a quality beachside suburb when you're a Sydney sider on Sydney money that only has to consider an hour and a bit commute. And especially with so many people living, working from home, and then coming to city once or twice, this is not as expensive as many people feel or as far as many people feel when you're thinking of it from a very Sydney-centric. But if you isolate it to the Central Coast region only and the Central Coast livers and workers, then it is more on the pricier side as a suburb for sure.
Interesting. Well, I was way off with 200 Ks, but it's still, that's a lot closer than what I was thinking. So I'm picking up what you're putting down there. The one thing that I wanted to kind of round this out with, though, is to pull it back to Alan's question about units versus houses. Now, I know you, and I know that you're not a fan of units. There's very few times that there's exceptions to that rule. But could we give Alan a little bit of an overview, I guess, on why that is and how that would apply to Terrigal?
Well, I'll give Alan a bit of a curveball to throw in there as well.
Okay.
Alan, if you can manage an Airbnb, you can do it extremely well. You can design the property. You can make sure that you manage it personally rather than give out 20% shares to managers along the way for Airbnb. Hey, Terrigal is making sense. And I have surveyed over 500 portfolios, and I know multiple people with Airbnbs there. And when I look at that, they're actually performing really well when I say cash flow wise, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so if you can't see yourself doing all of that, then guess what? It is another unit that has the risk of oversupply in due course, may not always be there now, and it doesn't have that land aspect that has been growing in value, and the trends are two worlds apart. You go look at Terrigal house price growth and you look at unit growth, and the house just wins every day of the week. So question is, what are you going to do with that property? How actively are you going to manage it? And if it's a Terrigal house or unit, I'd go house. But back to a bigger thinking point, if it's Terrigal versus somewhere else, I'm going somewhere else.
So this is a no.
Yeah, it's a no for me in terms of a location specifically for someone to capitalize in the short term, and that too a short term that's longer, because in the short term for the next 12 months, you can expect Terrigal's recovery to start to take shape. But if you're talking, hey, I want to hold this for the next 3 years and I'm going to see big value growth, then I would say that it'll need a decent amount of shift in a few fundamentals for Terrigal's value growth to explode over the next 3 or 5 years.
I feel like we haven't said go in a while. It's like
I think the main thing here is that people are picking a favorite location probably by personal opinion, and then they're asking for the data to validate it. And the point here is that the data may not always validate that, because I'm not here to tell you just the good news. I'm here to tell you what the data says. And right now the data says that Terrigal's had a phenomenal last 10 years. It's got high vacancy rates. And at the same time, over the last 12 months, if you look at the trends that we're seeing from days on market, housing inventory, and all these different aspects coming together, there are just some other locations that might show a little bit better in terms of its next few years. But if you isolate the next 12 months, inventory is extremely low. Prices did come back and they are stabilizing again. And if you're looking at that Sydney sider's mind of houses in Terrigal not being that expensive in comparison to houses in the beach side closer to Sydney, then these sort of signs come together. And when you look at this inventory, if it sustains this low level of inventory, then you're likely to see prices rise again for the next 12 months. I just can't see how the next 12 months turns into beating some other locations I'm seeing percentage-wise for the next 3 or 5 years. That's the core part.
So if Alan's looking at a high cash flow asset, he can actually manage the Airbnb himself. Maybe he lives in Terrigal, lives locally, then there's a bit of potential there.
Yeah, totally.
But otherwise it's like, nah, you're probably better off putting your money elsewhere.
Yeah, if it's an investment and you're hoping to get some decent yields on it and you're hoping to get it rented really quickly and you're hoping to see massive capital growth over the next 3 years, I just am not seeing all the things come together. But if you're okay to lose thousands of dollars, you want it to be a semi-beach, semi-home, like as an investment and home to live in and a holiday place, and you can tick so many boxes with this, then
lifestyle investment.
Yeah, why not? Right. So that's kind of my thinking. It just depends on the purpose you use it for.
Alan, I hope that answers your question, mate. And as always, Arjun Paliwal from InvestorKit, thank you so much for jumping on the show, mate.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.